Chapter 8. Given that ferns are not nearly as popular as they once were, you can hardly be expected to know that Osmundia regalis is the scientific name of the much-admired royal fern. It is a truly spectacular variety that can easily grow 6 feet tall, with arching, attractively shaped fronds and spore-bearing stalks that turn a pleasing shade of brown when fully mature. The spore-bearing stalks are called sporangia. Many would no doubt argue that sporangia is hardly a word worth memorizing. Yet one never knows when ferns will make a comeback. The forward-thinking among you will do well to jot it down. Sadly, the Piazza Hotel has long since been demolished to make way for the sort of retail establishments that people seem to prefer nowadays. Boutiques selling new clothes that have been made to look worn, banks that have run out of money, and cafes that brew coffee so strong as to be virtually undrinkable. But on the long-ago day that Miss Penelope Lumley was scheduled to dine with Miss Charlotte Mortimer, the fern court at the Piazza Hotel was in its prime. Its magnificent display of potted ferns was famous throughout Europe, as was its mouth-watering and inventive cuisine, courtesy of the legendary chef Philippe, a true master of the cutting board. Under normal circumstances, Penelope would have been surprised that the usually no-frills Miss Mortimer had chosen such an elegant restaurant for their meeting. She would have been thrilled at the prospect of seeing an important collection of ferns, and even felt some anticipatory tummy rumbles at the thought of eating what promised to be a truly delicious meal. However, just as a carelessly spilled puddle of India ink blots out the lines of practice cursive letters painstakingly written on the paper beneath, the anxiety-producing contents of Miss Mortimer's letter blotted out any other emotions Penelope may have had. What did Miss Mortimer mean that it was not safe to bring the children? And that she had bad news to deliver? And that Penelope should tell no one about their meeting? A chance encounter with a pickpocket on a train, a greedy scoundrel in front of Buckingham Palace, a strange remark from a fortune-teller, a mistress in high dudgeon. These were life's minor annoyances, and Penelope knew better than to make too much of them. But Miss Mortimer's letter seemed to imply that there was actual trouble afoot. What on earth could it be? All these worries and more swirled through Penelope's mind as she dressed for this long-awaited reunion. She briefly considered putting on the fine gray dress that she had worn to the Ashton Place holiday ball, but just thinking about the disastrous consequences of that night made her slip on one of her usual brown woolen frocks instead. She took a deep breath to calm herself, as all the girls at Swansburn were taught to do in a class called Do Not Panic. A Swanburn girl always keeps her wits about her. After a few inhales through the nose and exhales through the mouth, Penelope felt that her wits were, if not directly about her, then at least within arm's reach. Since I have never eaten in a fancy restaurant before, the experience is bound to be educational, she thought, with a renewed sense of purpose. In any case, the only way to find out what Miss Mortimer has to say is to go and hear it for myself. Dear Miss Mortimer, I hope she's not too changed after all these months. And so, with her eagerness to see her former headmistress only slightly dimmed by worry, and after obtaining assurances from Margaret that she would keep a close eye on the children while Penelope was out, since Penelope was forbidden to tell where she was going, her evasive reply that she would be having lunch with a friend simply made Margaret giggle and squeal about Simon Harley Dickinson all the more. Penelope double-checked the map, put on her best hat, which is to say, her only hat, and set off for the Piazza Hotel. Your table is this way, Miss Regalis. Try as she not, Penelope had not been able to make the maitre d' at the Fern Court understand that the reservation was not under the name Osmundia Regalis, but that she was intended to meet someone near the Osmundia Regalis. Still, she knew he was leading her in the right direction, for even among so many magnificent varieties, the Regalis was impossible to miss. The many potted specimens created a jungled grotto on the far side of the dining room, and the diners within it, if any, were well concealed by the delicately swaying fronds. Penelope wondered if it was a desire for secrecy that had prompted Miss Mortimer to choose this restaurant, not just an appreciation for ferns. But she didn't have to wonder for long. With a flourish, the maitre d' held back an armful of foliage so that Penelope could enter the leafy, secluded room. There, at a charming table for two, with her only companion being the thin plume of steam that rose lazily from the teapot before her, sat Miss Charlotte Mortimer, Changed or unchanged, bad news or good, it no longer mattered. The mere sight of her former headmistress, with her long, dark blonde hair pulled back in its familiar pretty do at the base of her neck, and her graceful, perfectly upright posture on display, even as she sat reading the newspaper. As Agatha Swanburne once said, to be kept waiting is unfortunate, but to be kept waiting with nothing interesting to read is a tragedy of Greek proportions. Why, it was all Penelope could do not to break into a run and hurl herself into Miss Mortimer's lap, just as she used to do as a child. But she is no longer my headmistress. Now we are colleagues and friends, she reminded herself. I must restrain myself from acting like a schoolgirl, for those days are behind me. And with that, she smiled, extended her hand, and spoke. Miss Mortimer, how nice it is to see you. Penny, dear Penny. Ignoring Penelope's offer for a handshake, Miss Mortimer flew to her feet and hugged her former student tightly. When she finally pulled away, her eyes glistened. It's wonderful to see you, my dear. It has been much, much too long. But you are always in my thoughts, believe me. Her voice was so tender, the feeling so warm and genuine, that Penelope felt all her newfound professionalism melt into a puddle. How silly she had been to think that time, distance, or anything else would ever alter her friendship with Miss Mortimer. The kind headmistress gestured for Penelope to sit. I hope you do not mind. I have already ordered lunch for us both. The food here is just as good as people say, but you absolutely must save room for dessert. Dear me, Penny, how grown up you look. You have become quite pretty. Did you know that? This unexpected compliment threw Penelope for a loop. Oh, my. Really, Miss Mortimer, I hardly think so. The light here among the ferns must be rather dim. I assure you I can see perfectly well. Even your hair has changed. Miss Mortimer frowned. I think you have not been using the Swanburne hair poultice as I asked you to do. Am I right? Well, we shall discuss that shortly. She unfolded her crisp white napkin and placed it neatly across her lap. Forgive me for asking, Penny, but I must know. While you are here with me, are the children being attended to? Of course. Penelope carefully imitated Miss Mortimer's actions regarding the napkin. There's a young housemaid named Margaret, one of the staff from Ashton Place, who has accompanied the family to London. She's watching them during my absence. I see. And this Margaret, is she trustworthy? She's young and can be silly at times. Penelope remembered the giddy way Margaret had teased her about Simon. I suspect she may not be a very good housemaid. Miss Clark is always scolding her about this and that. But when it comes to the well-being of the children, yes, she's completely trustworthy. I'm glad to hear it. Miss Mortimer's serious expression softened. Patient Penelope, I know you must be full of questions, and yet you sit there so calmly, as if nothing I might tell you could rattle your confidence. I admire your courage more than I can say. You do the Swanburne Academy proud. Penelope murmured humble thanks, but inside she was beaming, and incredibly curious. In my letter, I said I had some news for you. But first, I must hear about the children. Miss Mortimer leaned forward and lowered her voice, though they were the only diners in the hidden grotto. Do they ever speak of their days in the forest? Does Alexander, in particular, remember any of the time that may have come before? They haven't mentioned anything to me about it. Penelope spoke in a similarly hushed tone, since it would have felt awkward to answer in any other manner. But it's obvious from the way they behave that they spent their time in the company of wild animals. Despite their academic accomplishments, they remain very fond of howling, and are prone to chasing small edible creatures. And Beowulf does tend to chew, especially shoes. How fascinating. Miss Mortimer sat back and sipped her tea. Tell me more. They can be provoked by other things as well. Like any proud teacher, Penelope loved nothing more than to talk about her students. Why, just the other day, our trip to Buckingham Palace was cut short when the children mistook one of the palace guards for a bear. It caused quite a commotion. Miss Mortimer began to laugh. A bear? Why, because of the hat? Oh, that's priceless. Miss Mortimer's unexpected reaction jolted Penelope into a useful change of perspective. That terrifying business with the guard was nothing more than a funny escapade, really. Why had she not seen it that way before? Yes, it was quite a comedy, she said, laughing along with Miss Mortimer. Beowulf actually climbed on top of his head. His head? Oh my. Now the two of them were so merry that Penelope could barely finish the story. She was too busy gasping for air. And Cassiopeia tried to bite his leg. Miss Mortimer had to wipe tears of mirth from the corner of her eye with a napkin. We had another hilarious mix-up, too, with a fortune-teller. Penelope went on in the same jovial spirit. For if one unpleasant episode could be made into an amusing anecdote, why not all of them? Oh, the children were so distraught. They howled up a storm and later kept repeating some odd words the woman said to them. The hunt is on. It took Penelope a few seconds to realize that Miss Mortimer had stopped laughing. Not only that, the expression on her face had altered in a way that made Penelope feel chilled to the bone. The hunt is on, Miss Mortimer whispered. Her eyes darted around, as if she were worried someone might be eavesdropping. Are you sure that is what she said? That's what the children told me. Now all of Penelope's worry came rushing back at once, like a tidal wave, and the questions poured out. Miss Mortimer, why does that disturb you so? Why was it not safe for the children to come to lunch? What's the bad news you have for me? Miss Mortimer opened her mouth to reply, but at that very moment the most mouth-watering aroma Penelope had ever smelled in her life wafted over to their table. It was their first course, being wheeled through the ferns on a cart. Penelope and Miss Mortimer sat in awestruck silence as the waiter uncovered their appetizer plate. Penelope couldn't tell what it was, but the smell, it was positively scrumptious. Miss Mortimer inhaled appreciatively, picked up her fork, and took a slow, savoring bite. Fiddleheads Felipe, she said. Try it. You will be amazed. Fiddleheads? Ferns, Miss Mortimer explained. The curly tips of unfurled fern fronds. It makes an excellent tongue twister, does it not? Unfurled fern fronds, unfurled fern fronds. Only after Penelope had mastered saying unfurled fern fronds, tasted the fiddleheads Felipe, and admitted that they were beyond her wildest imagination of deliciousness, did Miss Mortimer begin to answer her questions. The hunt is on, she repeated, shaking her head. It is remarkable that you should have been given such a warning. But nothing surprises me any more. Penelope, the bad news is simply this. The children are in danger, even more so now than when they lived in the forest. What kind of danger? Penelope exclaimed. Why? From what source? Miss Mortimer paused and stared at her plate for a moment, as if some other, happier pronouncement might yet reveal itself. There is someone who wishes them ill. But he will not, he cannot harm them directly. However, he will do whatever he can to put them in danger's path. You have already seen evidence of this. You mean at the holiday ball? The headmistress nodded. When I received your letter some months ago telling me of the strange events of that evening, my suspicions were aroused. After much reflection, I thought I would share my concerns with you. I wanted to do it in person. It is why I asked you to come to London. But this warning from the fortune-teller confirms it. Penelope, do you believe in the supernatural? Penelope took another bite, for no conversation, however disturbing, could ruin a dish this tasty. Certainly not, but I did hear Lady Constance say once that Ashton Place must be cursed. Miss Mortimer was so startled she almost dropped her fork. She was complaining about how long the repairs were taking, Penelope quickly explained. It was only a metaphor, I'm sure. But why do you ask? Surely you don't put any stock in curses and crystal balls and such. Do you? There was a time that I did not. Miss Mortimer looked uneasy. But, as Agatha Swanburne once said, an open mind lets ideas out as well as in, I know. Penelope's thoughts began to pick up speed all at once, like a ball rolling downhill. Do you mean to suggest that there is some curse on Ashton Place, or that the woman might know something about the person who wishes ill to the children? For I have already sent an inquiry to a recent acquaintance, whom I hope can arrange an interview with the old woman. Never fear, Miss Mortimer. I am determined to get to the bottom of this. No! Even though Miss Mortimer kept her voice low, there was no missing her sharp tone. "Penelope, you must obey me in this. Do not go around asking questions. When I invited you to lunch, I had resolved to give you a general instruction to be on your guard. I felt it was prudent. I did not want the children here because I didn't want them to be frightened. But your news about the fortune-teller warning took me by surprise. I have already revealed more than I should." She looked at Penelope intently. "About curses and prophecies I will say nothing more, but you must take this to heart. It is in your best interest, and that of the children, that you not seek to know any more about this unfortunate business than you do right now." "But a Swanburn girl is curious. A Swanburn girl asks questions," Penelope protested, reciting the very rules her headmistress and other teachers at Swansburn had instilled in her. Miss Mortimer smiled. "Believe me when I say, on this particular point, no one would agree with me more than Agatha Swanburn herself." "But how am I to protect the children if I don't know what kind of danger they're in, or from what source?" Miss Mortimer took another bite and gestured for Penelope to do the same. "The same way you have protected them so far, by having faith in them, and seeing the best in them, and teaching them to see the best in themselves. Why, if you hadn't shown such compassion and love to the incorrigible children, how would they have ever been able to make friends with Nutsawoo?" "Nutsawoo?" Now Penelope felt hopelessly confused. "What does that silly little squirrel have to do with any of this?" "No one's fate is written in India ink, as Agatha Swanburn once said." Miss Mortimer underscored the point by gesturing with her fork. "The hunt is on, indeed. But the hunt can end in unexpected ways. The Incorrigibles and Nutsawoo have already taught us that much. Do you understand?" Penelope thought back to the night of the holiday ball, and the mad chase Nutsawoo had led through the house, with the children in pursuit. She remembered how desperately she had tried to find them, and how convinced she was that the Incorrigibles were about to make a gruesome snack of the poor wayward squirrel. "I think I do understand," she answered slowly. "You mean that even when the outcome seems inevitable, something unexpected can still happen, and so it might be better not to know too much about what has been foretold, so that one might keep an open mind, so to speak?" Miss Mortimer nodded. "It is all too easy for most people to simply march in step toward whatever future they believe lies in store. But many forces shape a person's destiny, Penelope," she added, "and a prophecy made before you were born cannot take into account the greatest influences of all." "Which are what?" The headmistress smiled again. "You, your own character, the kind of person you choose to be, and that you inspire others to be." Penelope frowned. "Are you sure there's nothing more I can do, then?" "Quite sure. Be brave and be true. Be the best governess you can be, and give the future a chance to rewrite itself accordingly." Miss Mortimer gestured with her fork. "And be optimistic, Penny, for the unexpected does quite frequently happen. As the poet said, the best laid plans of wolves and men gang aft ugly." "You mean mice," Penelope corrected. "Not wolves and men, mice and men." Mice, of course. How silly of me." Suddenly nervous, Miss Mortimer reached for her tea. Her hand trembled, but her voice remained firm. "Now let's speak no more of this and enjoy a marvelous meal. Tell me, have you begun reading the Giddy-Up Rainbow books to the children yet? Heavens, I remember reading them to you when you were scarcely bigger than Cassiopeia." The Fiddlehead Felipe was followed by Fruit Salad Felipe, Fried Fish Felipe, Fettuccine and Fennel Felipe, and numerous other courses, each one more tasty than the last. Miss Mortimer scraped the last bit of fondue Felipe from her plate. "Genius," she said decisively. "Chef Felipe has truly outdone himself today. Don't you agree?" She laid down her fork and dabbed her lips with the napkin. "Before I forget, Penelope, I have something for you." Penelope was about to protest, for she hadn't thought to bring a gift for Miss Mortimer. But when she saw the small, familiar package that Miss Mortimer removed from her purse, she understood. I must ask that you continue to use the hair poultice I gave you. Miss Mortimer pressed it into Penelope's hands. I brought you another packet so you will not run out. The truth was, Penelope hadn't bothered to open the last packet of hair poultice that Miss Mortimer had sent. And really, if the Incorrigibles were in some kind of danger, why waste time worrying about the condition of Penelope's scalp? But she knew her former headmistress well. For whatever reason, this business about Penelope's hair seemed to be a matter of real importance to Miss Mortimer, and there would be no argument. Do you promise to use it? There was a teasing twinkle in Miss Mortimer's eye, but she was intent on securing Penelope's sworn promise. On your honor as a Swanburn girl? Well, I suppose— Promise me, Penelope. Yes, I promise I'll use it, Penelope sighed. Though she was far from vain, the thought of returning to her former lackluster hair was not very appealing, especially after receiving the nice compliment from Simon Harley Dickinson. Excellent. I know you will keep your word, Penelope, as you always have in the past. Miss Mortimer was already perusing the dessert menu. Flan, Felipe, figs in filo, Felipe. Everything sounds delectable. But when at the Fern Court, one must order the tart, Felipe. No other dessert compares. By the way, how did you like the Hicksby's Guide? Penelope was in no mood for dessert. Both the meal and the conversation had been a great deal to absorb, and she was feeling quite overstuffed, in head, heart, and tummy. No, thank you. I'm too full for tart, Felipe, Miss Mortimer, she said politely. As for the Hicksby's, I'm grateful for the gift, of course. Yet, I confess I find it a curious volume. For example, it's supposed to be a guidebook to London, but the pictures all seem to be of Switzerland, or someplace similar, and a great many of the entries are in the form of little poems. That is curious. Miss Mortimer was still fixed on the dessert menu. They say that the head bakers from the finest patisseries in Paris come to the Fern Court. Take one bite of tart, Felipe, and collapse, weeping with envy. Penelope sighed. I think I'll just have another cup of tea. No dessert? What's the matter, dear? Miss Mortimer put the menu down. You look pale and sad all of a sudden. In fact, there was something troubling Penelope. It had occurred to her halfway through the frosted flakes, Felipe, and now she was not sure how best to raise the subject, other than to simply plunge ahead. So she did. Miss Mortimer, as you know, it has been many years since— The word parents felt so strange on her tongue, she had to will herself to say it. Since my parents left me in your care. Penelope glanced down and saw that she was twisting her napkin into knots. Perhaps they don't realize I've already graduated. Perhaps they've lost track of time. But it seems possible that they intend to return for me someday. And now that I have left Swanburn, I wouldn't wish— All at once, Penelope found her throat had tightened and it was hard to speak. I wouldn't wish for them to come back looking for me and not find me there. Have no fear, Miss Mortimer said quickly. She, too, seemed to be misty-eyed all of a sudden. Perhaps it was a consequence of some errant fumes from the onion soup being served at another table. I intend to remain headmistress at Swanburn Academy for many years to come. Should anyone of interest inquire as to your whereabouts, I will put you in touch with them directly. Penelope nodded. Thank you for your reassurance. That solves the matter completely. It did not, of course. It had been more than 10 years since Penelope had been deposited at Swanburn's doorstep. No letter, no birthday or Christmas presents. Not even a picture postcard had arrived during that long span of time. An ordinary person would have given up hope that the long-lost Lumleys ever intended to come back. Of course, Penelope was far from ordinary. Much as a well-trained seal can keep one ball spinning on its shiny black nose while balancing another upon its tail, for all those years, she too had managed to balance two somewhat contradictory beliefs. First, that since her mother and father would undoubtedly come back for her one day, their long unbroken silence was not something for her to feel lonesome or sad about. And second, that in the meantime, Penelope ought to go about her affairs exactly as if her parents were not in the picture at all. For, in fact, they were not. It was not an easy trick for a clever seal or a plucky young governess. But if there was one thing Penelope had learned from her headmistress, it was that worry, self-pity, and complaint were not how a Swanburn girl got through the day. Instead, just as one might use a ribbon to hold one's place in a fascinating book that one is temporarily forced to put down, Penelope simply made note of her confused and disappointed feelings and then put them gently to the side, for there was nothing to be done about them at present. At the same time, she observed that the mere act of posing this question about her parents to Miss Mortimer seemed to have lessened the heavy, burdened feeling inside her, the one she had assumed was the result of eating too much food, Felipe. "I believe I will have dessert after all," Penelope announced as she shook out her napkin, refolded it, and placed it neatly across her lap. "Followed by biscuits and more tea. Shall I summon the waiter?"